And welcome back to the Conflict Skills Podcast. I'm your host, professional mediator Simon Good. In this podcast, I provide free resources and tools for dealing with conflict, whether that conflict is connected to workplace situations or conflict outside of work. So if that sounds like the kind of thing that's useful to you, please consider pressing subscribe. In the episode today, I'm going to be following up on the previous episode of the podcast where I explained how to run a workplace mediation. Now, in that episode, I used a situation involving a manager and a staff member. And so as I went through and explained the different steps and the process that you could use to facilitate a mediation internally with your team, I sort of used some of those, specifics to inform the decisions that you might make. For example, if it's a manager and a staff member, there would be an inherent imbalance of power. And so I talked about some of the ways that we would both assess that for suitability of mediation, as well as some of the options that you have for managing it in terms of, the different interventions that are at your disposal. So what I thought I could do in today's episode of the podcast is to follow up with that and answer some of the frequently asked questions that I get around workplace mediation. I have been involved training new mediators. I'm a clinical supervisor for people who are practitioners of workplace mediation, and I do a lot of training with teams around conflict resolution skills. And some of the best workshops that I've run actually have been with HR teams. Like, obviously these have different connotations and acronyms depending on where you go. It's HR or ER or people and performance or people and quality or people and this and that. Whoever's sort of in charge of managing the humans, the people, you, I think, are often in a particularly challenging role because you're almost needing to remain impartial between, at times it is a manager, like a operations manager or a department head or something like that, and somebody else. Running a mediation session between these two people, it can be particularly challenging because it, to be frank, isn't just their two levels of power that you're managing. It's your own level of power in relation to these people too. And if you're facilitating a mediation and one or both of the people that are involved is more senior than you, well, that can be particularly challenging, I think. And so there might be additional steps that you need to use to establish your authority as the facilitator or whatever else it might be. And done my best to explore some of the different common questions, but particularly thinking about that as the focus, like somebody in that HR or employee resources team. This question is what is workplace mediation and how does it differ from other conflict resolution methods? And that's actually not something that I explored in much detail in the episode last week. I really just went in and said, if you did decide to do mediation, here's what it would look like. But to me, I think about mediation as somewhat different to the other options that you have. So as a HR manager, you should decide on the level of formality that will be needed. To me, I would use phrasing and language like I'd like to have a meeting, or I'd like to set up a conversation, or I'd like to organise a time to touch base, etc. when I wanted to do it a little bit less formally. Now that might be because of the context you're in. If you're a factory and you've got a couple of your staff on the assembly line who are in conflict, you might not want to make it a particularly formal connotation to the meeting. In other situations, like if there's been a number of actual formal performance management processes maybe, like the person's been on a warning and on probation or whatever the language is that you might use within your organisation, then you might want to jump straight to a higher level of formality. And so for me, when I call it a mediation, I think it does imply something different to a meeting. And then probably the level down from that even would be a facilitated conversation. So I think you've got all of those different options. Would you like to email them or meet with them and suggest you meet and facilitate a conversation? That might be more suitable when the focus is on the relationship, like what's happened in the past and how it's impacted them and the emotions that are involved and that kind of thing. But if the issue is more around something like structural, like a job description or a KPI and whether or not expectations are reasonable, then maybe a more formal option would be suitable for that. So consider the level of structure. So in the previous the podcast, when I was explaining how to run a mediation, I outlined the different steps and I guess almost the process that I tend to use and the one that I would recommend you use as a mediator or, an informal internal mediator. But you don't necessarily need to use that. Like you could still call the session a mediation, but leave it very open-ended. For example, at the beginning of the meeting or the mediation, you could just ask them something like, well, where should we start? Rather than giving each person a chance to speak and doing the more formal version of the opening statements and collating agenda items like I explained in the previous episode. So to me, I think you've got the options in terms of a facilitated conversation, a meeting, and then a mediation. And how it differs is the level of formality as well as the level of structure. I think the other essential difference, though, is the perceived difference in the eye of the people that are involved. Like if we call something a mediation, then it changes the way that they make meaning around it. They become the parties involved or they're the participants in the mediation, for example. And so I like that in the sense that it almost creates a little bit of difference from the day-to-day normal role that they might be in. Obviously this is a double-edged sword and there can be pros and cons. But calling something a meeting or calling something I'd like to facilitate a conversation between the two of you, I think sometimes it gives people a sense that they can get away with something. Whereas in mediation, one of the things that I like about it is that I think for some people it has almost like a legislative type of connection in their head, like you're mediating to reach an agreement, for example. Whereas a meeting, you might have minutes, an agreement for mediation, even it sounds better and more significant and like a bigger deal, doesn't it? And so I think that's also something that affects the people that are involved, both in terms of how they participate and prepare for the session and the process, but also how they follow through with the agreements that are reached. So when you call it a mediation, you might follow through with a more formal version of the agreement, like calling it an agreement from mediation or a goodwill agreement or something like that. Obviously it would depend on your organisation and the culture as to what's the best fit in terms of language, but that's different, I think, to I'm just following up on an email, capturing the notes from our meeting or something like that. Like it sets it apart. Question is, when should a manager consider using mediation to resolve a conflict? So I talked about the 3 factors that I would consider in terms of assessing whether or not a mediation is suitable. They were safety, willingness, and capacity. Safe, I suppose that could be something to do with suicidal ideation or some other concern that you might have for the staff member. There might be a legal duty of care that you owe responsibility, that you owe employees within your company or something like that you're responsible for. So safety could be a factor, but to be honest, I think it's probably not so much of a relevant issue to workplace mediation. So should you do mediation? It might be uncomfortable and it might be something that the people find a little bit confronting or something like that. But to me, that's not necessarily a reason why I wouldn't do mediation. So that would be the first thing I would say is that some managers I meet, they talk about being worried about how the staff will go in the mediation. And I say, well, can you tell me a bit more about that? And they'll say, they're just a person that's easily rattled or they've had their confidence shaken or they're going through a lot of personal issues outside of work with a divorce or something. And you can obviously see the point to all of these different concerns, but my response always is along the lines of, well, how is this playing out in the day-to-day? All of those issues that you talked about don't go away if we don't do the mediation. So that's probably influencing the communication between these two people. And of course, it probably will influence the way the mediation goes. And it will influence the way they interact whether or not you do the mediation or not. So to me, the fact that something's uncomfortable isn't necessarily a reason that people shouldn't do it or shouldn't be asked to do it or suggested to do it or however voluntary you decide to make the process. The next one was willingness. So are the parties willing? And I think what you're looking for is some type of a gesture of goodwill or a genuine effort to resolve the issue or, they're there to genuinely resolve it type of thing, genuine participation. All of these things ultimately are subjective decisions that you need to make. Are they willing or not? Well, you can predict how they're going to go and you might be right and you might be wrong, but you can probably do your best to anticipate what's going to happen. And I think what you need as the absolute minimum is that the parties are willing to both listen to the other side and that they're both prepared to put forward their view. So that would be the two things that I would consider not doing the mediation if they aren't there. Like if someone just wants to hear what the other side has to say, but they don't think there's any issue at all, I'm a little bit reluctant to do mediation in those kind of situations, because if I'm already observing such a limited amount of buy-in and engagement with the process, I think the chances of that person being willing to change their behavior is relatively low. I mean, obviously it's case by case. Sometimes that might be a genuine approach or response that the person has, like, I actually don't know, I'm really curious, I'd like to know what's going on from their side of things. But I think usually it's more like a stonewalling attempt, like, I don't know what you'd call it, like they're trying to gaslight the other person and pretend there's no issue when actually there is, or they're wanting to avoid a sense of responsibility for their contribution to the conflict or something like that. And then the final factor is capacity. And this is also something that you need to make a subjective decision about. Can the parties, I guess, bite their tongue enough to listen to what the other person has to say? Are you going to be able to rein things in if things get heated and a little bit out of control? Now, obviously, there's things that you can do to increase capacity, like having multiple shorter sessions, having them in separate rooms, offering them to bring a support person along, explaining the structure so that they're familiar with it, sending the agenda items out ahead of time and circulating that, and almost creating an agenda by email before you go into the room. There's particular things that you can do that will help the people participate in the session. So that's kind of support structures, or however else you would consider all of that. And so for me, they're the three things that I'd think about as a manager. Should you do mediation? Safety, willingness, and capacity are probably the different criteria that I would use. The question is, what are the roles of a mediator, manager, and staff member in the mediation? So should an operations manager do the mediation, or is it better for them to be separate? And, what's the effective role of the other staff and all this kind of thing, especially if one of them's there as a support person as well. And it's like one of those jokes around, how did a grandfather and a father and a son all walk into the bar and there was only one person there, or whatever that old, the lateral thinking puzzle was. This is a similar thing. It's like, how can a mediator and a manager and a staff member all be in the room at the same time? They were all the same person after all. So I'm going to assume you're not all the same person and you're acting as the mediator. You're probably in the HR team, would be the typical default scenario that I've noticed. Then you would often have a line manager or an operations manager or a team leader or something like that in the room. And then you will often have the staff member themselves. So for me, I think the mediator's role there is to facilitate the session. If you're wearing two hats, so to speak, and you've got two things that you need to do, like maybe your job is to facilitate the meeting, but as a HR staff member, you also want to note the existing performance management process, or the organisation has particular ideas around what will happen if the mediation isn't successful and you want to let the parties know that, then I would do my best to structure that so that it's quite distinct. Like I would literally say something like, look, just as my manager's hat as a way of beginning the session, I wanted to let you both know that I do have confidence in the two of you for resolving this issue. I'm aware that it's affected you both now for a number of months, and there's probably particular structural elements that have contributed to it as well. So I'm certainly not trying to imply that everything here is all of your fault, but I do hope that the session today is a step forward in the right direction of re-establishing a positive working relationship between the two of you. I don't expect you to be friends, and frankly, that's not something that's probably realistic at this stage. But what we're aiming for is respectful communication that's working in terms of the interactions that you need to be having together. So I suppose I want to just outline that in terms of my manager's hat at the outset. And from here, I'll do my best to neutrally facilitate the discussion, and I won't really be providing input from here forward. Drawing a line in the sand, this is what I needed to say first, this particular whatever. And now I'm going to enter into facilitator, mediator mode, if you know what I mean. The question is, how do you prepare both parties for the mediation session? So in the previous episode of the podcast, I talked about I actually like having a one-on-one meeting with both of the parties. Now that has a dual purpose. First, I want to assess the mediation and to let me know what's going on, and I'm thinking about decisions around how to structure it and should they be in the same rooms and how am I going to manage ground rules and all this kind of thing. But I also do it a lot in terms of preparing the parties. And the method that I found most helpful to prepare staff for a mediation is the GROW coaching process. So that's an acronym: goal, reality, options, and way forward. There's a fantastic book called Coaching for Performance by Robert Whitmore, I think it is. It's a really good book that outlines those 4 steps, and I've actually got a number of different podcast episodes and training courses on how to use that model. But in short, there are 4 different topics, and these would be the kinds of questions that I would be asking the participants. So the goal question might be something like, what needs to change for the two of you to have a more workable relationship? What would that look like day to day? You don't need to be friends, but what's like the bare minimum in terms of communication that's manageable and that's effective, so to speak? So I'm drilling down into what are we actually aiming for here? That's the first step, the goal. Then the reality is, can you walk me through how things are at the moment? Like what's happened in the past, but I'm particularly interested in how things are right now. And what we're aiming for is as detail of focus as possible. We really want to drill down to the fine detail. Like when you say that the meeting went badly last week, how did it begin? Like, were you in your office or theirs? Was it something that was in the calendars ahead of time, or did it begin by one of you beginning the conversation ad hoc? Like, I'm really drilling down, and my goal there is to increase the person's level of awareness. The third step is options, and when I'm preparing someone for a mediation, I often do that very tentatively. Like, look, you don't need to make any decisions right now. This isn't the time to get locked into anything, but let's just do a little bit of brainstorming. What do you think might help? In terms of this step, it sounds like this is something that you think might be a good solution. That could be something that you agree to. What other ideas have you thought about, or what other options have you considered? Facilitating brainstorming there and going for quantity over quality. And I absolutely love this because it almost kicks the person into this option generation, problem solving type of mindset. Final step would be way forward. That would be questions like, what's next for you? How are you going to manage this? Steps. And I would usually start preparing the parties by like applying that framework to the issue, if you know what I mean. Like, this is the problem, this is the other person's behavior, whatever else it might be. Sorry, I could probably hear my notification going off in the background there. So we would apply the coaching process to the conflict, to the issue itself, the relationship that you're there for the mediation to do. But I would also think about those same steps, the GROW, goal, reality, options, and way forward, for the mediation. In other words, how are you going to prepare for the mediation? Like when they raise something that's out of left field and it catches you off guard, what do you need to do to stay calm during that kind of conversation so that you don't get sucked into, biting back or something like that? I often do it like that. It's like, we don't want you to be trapped by the conflict. We don't want you to get sucked into the conflict. We don't want that conflict to start trying to get you. So what do you need to do to keep distance from some of the agenda items that we're discussing, especially the ones that are a little bit more controversial? Doing there is, I think, encouraging them to think about self-management and self-care. And I like that framing much more than, what do you need from me? No, I just want to make sure that the mediation's comfortable for you. Like, I just wonder how realistic that is, because these two people are going to need to interact tomorrow. You know what I mean? Like, so if you make the mediation really comfortable, I'm just not sure what you're achieving at the end of the day. To me, I think it should be realistically comfortable, and doing it somewhere private and maybe giving them time to prepare and not go straight back to work together afterwards could be some options to do it. But yeah, I don't know. I'd be curious to know your take on all of that. I think sometimes we've conflated the idea of being supportive as that we don't want the staff to experience any negative emotions. And then on the other hand, we've got very abusive relationships within some organisations where staff are completely unsupported. So yeah, it's a real balancing act, isn't it? And I honestly think a lot of these things are much more subjective than people realise, and as a result, you're inherently dealing with a dilemma. And I think that would be a more helpful way of approaching it than kind of assuming that there's a right and wrong and getting very defensive about the fact that obviously you're right and the other person's wrong. Key ground rules for a successful mediation is the next question. So I only usually use 2, sometimes 3. The first rule I often use is don't interrupt each other. The second rule that I often use is respectful language. Don't be abusive, don't swear, don't do name calling. Sometimes I use what I would consider to be a little bit more childish kind of language, even when I'm dealing with staff, like we agree not to call each other names and make derogatory comments or something like that. Other times, especially when I'm dealing with, very capable, intelligent kind of people, I just say something like respect. Personally, I tend to write as few words on the whiteboard or on the data projector as possible, so I'd probably just write, don't interrupt, use respectful language. But you could expand it and say something like, we will treat each other with respect at all times, or something like that. I even know if there's a lot of conflict between the staff, like you're a little bit worried that they're not going to be able to follow the rules, so to speak. You're worried that they're not going to be on their best behavior and it's going to end up in a complete, argument or something. You could consider printing out the rules and getting them to sign it. Sometimes that's called an agreement to mediate, and there might even be other particular things that you're asking them to commit to by doing the mediation, like keeping it confidential, for example. So they would also be other things that you can include on the printed agreement as well. The ground rules, they're my favourites. Don't interrupt and use respectful language. The third one I sometimes include is that thing along the lines of I'm in charge. Like we will follow the instructions of the mediator, or we agree to be led by the mediator, or as the mediator, Simon is in charge of the sessions and can make decisions around taking breaks or ending the mediation at any time. It's something like that. If you think that that would be helpful and you're wanting to shore up your authority, I suppose it's something that you could consider. Personally, I don't think it would match my style, and I can't imagine doing that. I'd almost want probably to keep it a little bit informal, and if it turns into a real nightmare, that's how it is, and it's probably how it was going to be tomorrow anyway. But for me, that's something that I usually keep a little bit light touch as the ground rules. But to be honest, you could probably add as many as you want. I know some mediators add ground rules like confidentiality. They include things like only speak for yourself, don't talk for others. They might include things like I agree to answer reasonable questions that I'm asked. We could agree to things like keeping the conversation contained to the future and the solutions rather than the past and the problem. Or maybe there are particular topics that are off, like they're out of bounds, like one person or both people don't want to discuss them. So that could also be a ground rule that you include, like we're not going to discuss the Christmas party last year or something like that. There was a particular incident at the Christmas party. I mean, honestly, I think the people who don't work in HR are probably underestimating some of the levels of complexity that HR teams are often forced to deal with, especially after a Christmas party, and especially if there might have been alcohol or other factors involved. So the next question is, how do you handle a situation where one party refuses to participate? You've written to the parties or you've met with them and you've offered them mediation, but one of them says no. Well, one of the factors that makes mediation is that it's voluntary. So I think ultimately I would still give them the chance to choose. And if they decide not to participate in the mediation, I suppose ultimately that's a decision that they can make. What is reasonable is that you should outline the consequences of that decision. In other words, if they decide not to participate, this is what's going to happen next. Now, you could keep that reasonably general and say, look, it's totally up to you. Participation's voluntary. Or both of you is not comfortable or you decide not to participate in the mediation, then I'll need to consider other options. Like at least I'm flagging there, this won't be the end of it. But I sometimes think it's better to imply a little bit of, not pressure, but I suppose there's a kind of transparency that you want to let them know that there's something at stake, if there is. Like if this problem between their working relationship is so significant that soon you're going to be putting them on probation and giving them a formal warning or firing one of them or restructuring or something, I don't know, to me there's not a whole lot to lose by just naming that and putting it on the table. You know them, so you don't want to panic them and cause issues, and if there's already gossip and back-channeling and stuff happening, maybe you do want to keep it a little bit low-key and low stakes. But sometimes I think it's worth saying to them, ultimately, the decision of whether or not to participate in the mediation is voluntary. If you decide to participate, I've included some information about the structure and the next steps. Or if one or both of you elect not to participate in the mediation, this is the additional steps that would happen in that case. So it might be saying something like, In that case, what I'd like to do is to meet with both of you separately with one of the department heads, and we'll need to consider options for moving forward. So I'll say at least I'm going to increase the level of formality by bringing in one of the big bosses and meeting with you both for a formal meeting or something like that. It's formal, letting them know that it's a process. I think all of those things are implying that, you're not going to get away scot-free with just saying I couldn't be bothered. Is, what should I do if emotions run high during a mediation? So I talked a little bit about, remember that you might need to de-escalate the process as you go during the episode last week. But to be honest, I didn't talk about what you would actually do. So in terms of that de-escalation steps, for me, it's about what I say and how I say it, as well as like my tone of voice and body language and all that kind of thing. In terms of voice, you would want to use a voice that's low volume, slow speed, and lower tone. Those are the three factors which tend to help to calm people down. So if someone's getting really angry and they just can't believe it, and how dare you accuse them of this, and this is bloody ridiculous, and blah, 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 blah. You shouldn't match them, it's not going to be helpful to meet them up there. It's very difficult when you're a mediator because you do sort of need to raise your volume to speak over the top of them in some situations. But wherever possible, I would avoid that. I tend to find using silence or actually really lowering my volume, especially when I lower the tone and slow down the pace where I'm speaking. Sometimes I find that can be helpful. You've also got other options for escalating your level of authority. So you could, if you're using a whiteboard, like put your marker down in a very dramatic fashion, or close your notebook. It's like, I'm not sure we're going to continue here. Close your laptop, turn off the data projector screen and look them both in the eye kind of thing. You could sit up straighter and occupy a little bit more space. Sometimes you might even stand up, and so you're a little bit above them, explaining to them that if they continue to interrupt, that you're going to need to end the mediation. Their names, you could, use body language. There's all sorts of different ways that you can up the ante in terms of establishing your assertiveness. But before that, I would go straight to de-escalation. So that would be the opposite of all these things. It would be slowing down and limiting body language and movement, looking them in the eye, but in more of an empathic, supportive kind of way, maybe leaning back in my chair and nodding and giving them a sense that I understand where they're coming from to some extent. So the voice that we use would be the low volume, low tone, slow speed, and then body language would be very non-threatening wherever I can do that. So I'm not wanting to jump in, and I'm trying to almost be like, we can manage this. Let's just take a moment here and take a breath. And what I can do is maybe explain options for the next steps, and then you two can have a chance to decide what's going to work best. I mean, before we make any of those decisions, it might be helpful to take a break. But it would be okay if maybe I just do a little bit of a summary, and then we can figure out next steps. You need to use factors like certainty, status, relatedness, fairness, etc. So fairness, for example, you could say something like, look, I know these are controversial issues. So far, you've both had a chance to put forward your view, and I've listened to what you've had to say. I'd like now to turn to this, and what I'm going to do is give you 5 minutes and then give you 5 minutes. So that immediately establishes this sense of fairness, like we're both getting the same chance, so to speak. You could add certainty. I really like to emphasize relatedness, to empathize and lean in with long summaries and just to acknowledge what they've both shared. I find this tends to be really helpful in a mediation session, and in some ways I think you're almost like empathizing on behalf of the other party. Like they haven't really said it to you, they've said it to the other person that they work with and say, you've done this, or you've said this, or I can't believe you did this, or that was so hard for me, or whatever. But when you jump in and empathize to what they've said, that does sound really difficult for you, and it doesn't actually sound like it was just the impact on you that was part of the problem. It was the way that other people within the team were affected, and that was a real sense of injustice for you, that they were suffering for something that ultimately wasn't their fault. Like, let's imagine that you jump in and summarize what the person's just said in front of the other person. It's almost like first aid empathy or something like that. So they would be the steps that I would probably be focusing on when the emotions are running high during the mediation. The question is, how do you ensure that both parties feel heard during the mediation? First thing that you could do is to discuss it with them. Like, what would help you to feel heard during the mediation? What do you need? And they might say, I need to make sure that it's balanced and we both have a chance to have our say, or I'm not interrupted, or they're not talking over the top of me, or something like that. But I think there's also things that you can do, like those longer summaries. To be honest, I don't think many of us feel understood when someone says, I understand. It sometimes actually can come across as a little bit patronizing. Like, how could you bloody understand? Like, you've got no idea what I've been through. I think sometimes that's almost the knee-jerk emotional reaction that we have. Whereas when someone says something a little bit more genuine, like, I'm not sure if I could fully understand what that's been like for you. You've explained a little bit of it, but gosh, it really sounds like that's just the tip of the iceberg. I don't know if that resonates at all. You'll often see them nodding and they've got tears in their eyes or something like that. It's that summary. It's when you play it back to the person and you take it seriously. Like, I don't just mean summarizing it for them. Like, for you, that sounds really difficult. It's like, I can really see how this would be an incredibly tough situation to be in. And I'm not agreeing with them. It's like from your perspective and how you see things and where you sit, etc. But yeah, it is like that. It makes sense. And even if you don't agree with them, I think that's an incredibly critical tool to develop as a manager, as a HR professional. It's that active listening skill set. Is if one party dominates the conversation, how do you balance the discussion? So that's a situation where you can use structure, like maybe I'll give you 5 minutes and I'll give you 5 minutes. You could sometimes do a little bit of emergency empathy on behalf of the more quiet party. Like, it sounds like actually this was something that was important to you. You raised it earlier. It's not something that you've brought up since then, but I was just wondering, would that be some of the concern that you have with what the other person's proposing? So I'm being curious. I'm saying, I'm just wondering if that thing that might be an issue for you is actually an issue. I might be completely off track here. I don't want to inject something that's a red herring, but is that something that would concern you? So I'm kind of being curious, but I'm encouraging the more quiet party to inject their needs or their concerns or their interests, etc., into the session where that's appropriate. I think sometimes you need to be a little bit assertive and just stop letting the person dominate the conversation. Like, people, what's that old saying? Like, behavior that is rewarded will be repeated. So if the person got away with interrupting the other person in the mediation, they're not going to stop. And so when you jump in and don't let them get away with it, like stop them speaking and explain that now you're going to shift the focus to the other person, or even that you're going to take a break if they continue, you'll find pretty early on that they learn that that's not something that is allowed and tolerated, and their behavior is more likely to change as a result. The question is, how do you know if a mediation has been successful? Look, I don't think you do. It's sort of like the proof is in the pudding, and some of the mediations that I've done in that afternoon, I felt like an absolute superstar legend. I was the best mediator in the world, and then I got an email or a phone call the next day saying that one or both of them have quit and they've lodged formal complaints against the other person, or who knows what, I haven't actually had them go quite that pear-shaped, but sometimes I thought we've made real progress, this is an absolute success, and all of a sudden there's some bad news. To be honest, I reckon it's actually factors outside of the mediation room that's often contributing to this. Maybe they get home and their partner grills them on the mediation and they're not happy with what the person's agreed to, so they cop it, and then the staff member arrives tomorrow and they've reneged on their agreement. Or maybe it's just the fact that they were in such a heightened state and, they feel like they've been tricked or maneuvered or something like that. So that evening they become a bit like a cat that's trapped in the corner and they're lashing out, and so they've decided to say something that's not helpful, and all of a sudden the conversation has gone off track and all of your good work in the mediation has come undone. I just don't think you know. And I certainly don't think I'm successful in the mediation because either I think it was good or because the participants think it was good. Sometimes the participants think it sucked, but the reason that they think that it sucked is because they haven't been allowed to get away with everything. So I'd be really careful about what the metrics are that you consider in terms of success. I know I've worked with some mediators and they say, I've got a 69% success rate or something like that. I mean, obviously it's going to sound arrogant, but I think I could probably get close to 100% success rate if my only goal was to get to an agreement. If I didn't care whether or not the agreement was followed through with afterwards and whether or not what we were actually agreeing to was going to help the relationship, then sure, I could get to an agreement about everything. It would just be we agree to treat each other with respect. I'd probably just be copy and pasting whatever your ground rules are for staff to follow normally. And to be honest, I think most workplace mediations aren't a whole lot better than that. It just says something ambiguous, like we will treat each other with respect. And sometimes I think it's just an administrative step that people need to go through in this bureaucratic process of firing someone. I don't know if that rings true for people who are overseas, but certainly in Australia, I think a lot of managers just struggle with getting rid of staff, and sometimes mediation is almost like ticking the box in that process. Of course, it can be so much more, but I think sometimes that's the way that it's perceived anyway. Seven is, what happens if the mediation fails to resolve the conflict? I think there you're looking at probably additional steps, and you've got two paths that you could go down. One would be more support. So you could give them EAP programs and counselling and coaching and meet with them. You could have a senior manager agree to sit in on their meetings or be CC'd into emails or something like that. Like, it's what do you think would help them? You've got those options, but you've also got the other path, which is more assertiveness. It's very clearly establishing expectations and particularly boundaries. It is giving them limited support, but also encouraging self-efficacy and autonomy. And ultimately what you're doing is giving them a sense of responsibility and outlining the consequences if things change or if they don't. So to me, that's probably the path that I would be going down if the mediation hasn't been helpful, unless it was just so emotional and they really did try, but it was too much for them. Sure, I could consider some counselling and then come back for a mediation in that kind of context. But usually speaking, it would be, look, I know that the mediation wasn't helpful or you didn't find that it was particularly productive or however you want to phrase that. Even something like mediation didn't get to the agreement that's needed. Moving forward, this is what's going to happen. Arrangement, this is what I expect from you. Much as possible, helpful to drill down to the actual behaviours. Use language like be respectful at all times or not use demeaning language or respond promptly. Use like the SMART acronym almost, like how are you going to know if they're doing the right thing or if they're not? Like what's a reasonable amount of time to respond to an email? When should they CC in the senior manager if that's a problem that one person keeps doing it to dob and be a tittle-tattle on the other staff? Like thinking through all of those things, and I think just clarifying it ahead of time, it means that people know where they stand. And they might not follow through with it. And to be frank, that's often quite helpful for you in the HR role because then you've got a little bit more, what would you say, grounds for dismissal or performance management or something like that. Question is a quick one. How long does a typical workplace mediation session last? So in terms of the joint mediation session itself, the maximum that I would recommend is 3 hours. And for myself, that's the longest that I will schedule a mediation. I sometimes will schedule it shorter than that for 2.5 or 2 hours. To be frank, I would only usually do that because of necessity. Like the staff could only have that much time available or something like that, or we could only book the room or whatever. And then as well as that joint discussion, the joint meeting where they're both there, I would meet with them both separately for around 1.5 hours each. I'd probably schedule that in the diary for 2 hours and just let them know ahead of time that we might not need it. But I just wanted to make sure that it was available if it was. And if you finish early, let them go and grab a coffee or something like that. This is something that's your style and it depends on your context, but I really like doing that one-on-one meeting in the afternoon when it's my team. And then I send them home so they don't have any extra crap piled on with whatever the negative impression is that they've got of the other person in between. Like hopefully I've added some positive seeds and they're considering what they can do to, contribute to a solution or something. And I don't want that to come undone. And then I try and schedule the mediation first thing the next day. I think people are often brighter and less weighed down by all the stress of the day in the morning. So the morning meetings tend to go better. And then where possible, I'd usually send them home afterwards. So, it's a little bit of give and take. Probably that's a bit of fairness that I'm asking them to do a hard thing and then I don't expect them to go back and continue on their normal role immediately afterwards. They've sat down with this person that they're at war with. On the hand, it's also giving them a chance to reflect and minimising the chance of negative interactions between the two of them outside of that mediation process. The question is, should mediation outcomes be documented and how should this be done? It depends. You don't necessarily need to document the agreements from the mediation, and where the focus was more on the relationship between the parties, maybe it's not helpful to document it. Like maybe it's better to leave it as something like, well, look, this has been a very difficult discussion. You've both talked about difficult topics and done your best to listen and control the emotions throughout all of this. And to be frank, I've been very impressed by the level of self-management that you've both been able to display. You've said what needs to be said and you've both listened to the other party and their perspective on things. And so what I would suggest from here is that you both give it some time to reflect and there might be some additional things that you want to say or follow up with and we can organise another meeting if needed, maybe tomorrow or the next day. I'm not sure if it's necessarily something that I need to take minutes around or send a record, but if there's something in particular that the other person said that's resonated with you or an agreement that you'd like to make together, it's certainly an option that we have. So would it be okay for now just to give it some thought, and then maybe I can touch base with you both tomorrow morning? How does that sound? That's the approach. It's like, let's keep things informal and just see how it goes. And I'm literally saying to them, I don't think I need to take minutes here. What do you reckon? In other situations, I would approach it more formally and say, what I'll do next is to send this out as you can call it an agreement for mediation. You could call it a memorandum of understanding. You could call it a memorandum from mediation, or memo from notes from the mediation session scheduled at this date, or something like that. It's up to you. I think all of those different phrasings do probably affect how people consider it and how they react to it. And so what's the right approach? You would probably know best. Even if you write it down and you call it something formal, like an agreement to mediate, you could also then make it more formal. Like you could say, I'm going to keep a record on both of your personnel files. Or you could say, I'm going to share a record with the department head or the operations senior manager or something like that. Would get them to sign the document. You could give them a printed record. You could set a review meeting in 6 months' time where you'll meet and go through it together and update if needed. Like, these are all also additional steps that you can take to formalize it and legitimize it, at least in terms of the perception, even more so. The question is, what are the best ways to follow up after a mediation session? I talked about this briefly in the episode last week, where I would normally try not to meet and not to interact with the people involved in the mediation. Like if I was in a HR hat and I managed a mediation between a manager and a staff member, I'd probably try to have limited interaction with both of them after that session. Especially, I think the manager sometimes wants to call and get your inside take on it, but of course that's going to impact on your perceived impartiality. So I might, if it's the case, explain to them that I'm not available to speak this afternoon, but we could organise a time to touch base briefly the next day. Because it gives them a chance to reflect, and it doesn't, I guess, give them the opportunity to try to suck me into their side of the story as they're bubbling away and stewing about, all of the very untrue things that the other person said about them or whatever else it might be. Follow up with the agreement itself, and I think doing that as soon after the meeting as possible. I just wanted to follow up with a draft, and calling it a draft, I think, is particularly helpful because it lowers the stakes if you've missed something or there's something that has upset them in hindsight or whatever else it might be. And then the next day, I reckon just a quick meeting. And usually I just ask them, was there anything that came up during the session yesterday that surprised you or that you weren't expecting? Was there anything that concerned you? And is there anything that you're left with afterwards, like, some negative impact or something like that? Was there anything that surprised you? Was there anything that concerned you? And, what are you needing? Is there anything that you need from here? I think they're 3 helpful questions to ask. I'm not really saying, what did you think about this? Or they said that was a good thing, wasn't it? What do you reckon? It's not to be the cheerleader and explain to them how helpful this is. I just want to make sure that they're supported. The next question is, how can managers encourage employees to engage in mediation? Do you think it's your role to encourage employees to engage in mediation is probably the first question to consider. If you do, why? Is it because you think that it would be helpful for them, or you're aware that they're going to get punished if they don't, or something like that? I just think telling the truth sometimes is the best option, and so maybe just being transparent where possible is one thing that you could do. No, the way that I often approach mediation and discussing it with people is that I say to them something like, look, I suppose it's up to you whether or not you participate. So I'm giving them a sense of control early on, the autonomy that I talk about in de-escalation skills training. It's up to you. You don't have to. Ultimately, it's up to you whether or not you agree to participate. Phrasing I use, I don't say something like, are you happy to do mediation? Or what do you reckon? Do you think mediation might be helpful? Of course, they don't think mediation is going to be helpful. They've been in conflict with this person for 12 months and the organization's willing to spend thousands of dollars, engaging a mediator or training or whatever else it might be. So no, they don't think the mediation is going to be bloody helpful. Instead, you should ask, are you willing to participate in the process? It's almost like I want to acknowledge and validate the doubts and the concerns that they have by saying something like, look, you probably don't have a lot of hope. That's okay. Say that's fine. I can hold on to the hope for now. Really asking is whether or not you're prepared to attend the mediation session, so show up for the meeting, to share your perspective on the issues, and it'll be reasonably structured. We'll come up with an agenda and you'll kind of take turns putting forward your perspective, that kind of thing. And then you don't necessarily have to agree to anything, but that would be the purpose of the meeting, is to see where we can get in terms of options, and maybe there's some opportunity for you to get on the same page moving forward. What do you think? So that's how I'd explain it. And the reason that I think that works is because it lowers the stakes. It gives them that sense of autonomy and being in charge. It provides certainty, and they know what to expect if they do decide to join in the process. And it's also, I think, quite an empathetic way of doing it. It's like, look, ultimately, you've probably got some concerns. I'm happy to talk those through if that would be helpful, as opposed to saying it's going to be much better than you think, or something like that. The question is, can the mediation be used for conflicts involving more than two people? Yes, it can, and you can still call it a mediation. But for me, when I've done this internally, when there's been conflict within a team, I haven't had it within my team, but I've been a manager and called in to act as an informal mediator for another section of the organisation. I actually chose not to call it a mediation. I thought in that case, it's probably better to call it a facilitated discussion or a facilitated meeting or something like that. I like that phrasing because it's unusual, like it sets it apart from just a meeting. It's a facilitated meeting. And it kind of implies something about the structure, like, I'm going to be in charge. There's going to be a facilitator type of thing. You can still call it a mediation, and I suppose I would do that if it was formal. Like if I was going to come up with an agenda and hopefully work towards an agreement from mediation, then I would call it mediation. The other option that you've got is that like maybe you've got one manager in the organisation and they're in conflict with three people. And so you're trying to decide, should I do the mediation like with all of them in the same room or three separate, if you know what I mean? And there you're probably weighing up factors of, well, they're going to be outnumbered and the three staff are going to gang up on them or something like that. And if you do three separate mediations, I mean, you're forcing the person to go through this reasonably, it's not traumatic, but it's a pretty uncomfortable experience for a lot of us to go through a workplace mediation, and you're going to make them do it 3 times. Honestly, it's a dilemma, and my approach usually would be to discuss it with that person who was the one against the 3, and maybe talk to them about what they think would work best, etc. And where I've done a mediation and it's been 3 against 1 or something like that, I think it's usually good to use the structure to manage that imbalance of power. So you could give that person an option for a support person. You could balance the time talking so that it's not like each person gets 25%, if you know what I mean. It's more like 50% for the manager and 50% for the other 3 split between them. And when that balance starts to shift and it's becoming too imbalanced, you might jump in and do some summaries to not reinforce the manager's perspective, but you're wanting to balance the airtime almost. Of course, all these things is about the vibe and the feel, and you're doing your best to discern what's going on and make a subjective decision in the moment. But they would be the kind of things that I would be considering. The question is, what should a manager do if the conflict involves themselves? So you've got a HR manager maybe, and they've got a history with the parties, and so they've been asked to do the mediation, but on the other hand, they're not walking in with a clean slate. I think honestly the best approach there is to be transparent and to name it up front. Of course, you have an existing relationship with both of them. There might be concerns that they have that one person's getting more time or that you're taking sides. And the way that I would often approach it is to say that I would welcome you to come and talk to me about that if that's an issue. And then checking in and making sure that, there's not concerns that are sitting there as you go. So maybe in the one-on-one session, talking to them about the fact that you've got an existing relationship with both of them and what do they think would be helpful for them to get a sense that the process was fair. Would they find helpful to raise it with you if there's an issue? Like maybe saying to them, if you'd like, you can ask to have a private meeting with me. And if you think the other person's having, talking over the top of you or you're being railroaded or something, then we can discuss it. And maybe there's some additional steps that we can take from there to manage that. But what I need is for you to let me know how you're traveling. I'm not a mind reader as much as I've done this type of work for a while now. So I need you to let me know how you're going. How does that sound to you? The question is, are there situations where mediation isn't the right approach? And if so, what are the alternatives? Look, there certainly are. I think when the person is clearly in breach of some type of a code of conduct, you can decide what are you going to do about it. But if you're not confident that the other person has a genuine capacity to change or a genuine willingness to change, then I'd probably just jump to a performance management step or getting rid of them or whatever else it might be. The other steps that you could consider is a coaching process, like in that 3 against 1 type of dynamic, which is pretty common. Like you've got one manager and they're in conflict with a few of their team or a few other people involved. Well, you could consider something like coaching or training for that person, like services that I do, and there'll be other locals around you as well. Giving them some additional tools to manage communication and finding the balance between where's assertive and where's coming across as aggressive or whatever else it might be. You could maybe give them some resources, like maybe there's audiobooks or different tools that you'd like to download that you've found helpful that you could send them. You could give them some coaching if you're in the HR team and you've got a little bit of that people management skill set, you've got the communication skill set, which a lot of HR staff do have. Maybe talking to them practically about what they could tweak in terms of the way that they manage meetings or the language in their emails when they ask for the daily updates or whatever else it might be. So giving them direct feedback. When you do this is the impact that I've noticed. Would you consider doing this? Something like that. Or the positive confrontations framework that I sometimes talk about. What, ask, check. This is what you've done. This is what I want you to do differently. How does that sit with you? Are there any questions kind of thing? Like you don't need to do a mediation if it's obvious what's causing the problem and you just want the other person to behave differently. My approach usually would be to ask them to do it. I just think that's such an obvious no-brainer that is avoided very, very often in workplace relationships. You have to ask for what you want. If the person doesn't change, what you'll need to do is gradually escalate the level of assertiveness that you use. Clearly, like identifying the gap. This is what I've asked you to do, but this is your current behavior. You want to start to outline consequences if the behavior doesn't change, and then ultimately probably give them an ultimatum. This is your final step. If the negative behavior continues, this is the consequence. Like we're going to put you on a formal performance management process, and then reinforce the positive behavior. Like this is what I want you to do. This is the consistent behavior that we need to see. And then you talk about the positive consequence for them. This is how your life is going to improve if you'll start to toe the line and do the right thing in terms of compliance or safety or whatever the thing is that you're asking the staff member to do. So I wouldn't do a mediation when it's pretty clear who's doing what and it's just the wrong behavior. I'd probably just deal with that more directly. Situations where you might not do mediation are those 3 factors that I talked about in terms of suitability. So that was the safety, willingness, and capacity. If for whatever reason any of those 3 aren't there, person's telling you that they couldn't be bothered listening to the other person and their boss is a jerk and they're in the wrong job anyway, then you're probably not going to get very far in mediation. And if they're so volatile and erratic that they just can't listen to what the other person has to say, then, I probably wouldn't do mediation. I'd keep them in separate rooms and do something a little bit more formal and structured. How does that sit with you? Of course, these are all just my natural responses, and most of these questions that I've gone through, actually, it's quite subjective. And I think if you asked a number of different mediators, they might even give you a number of different options. Idea for next week's episode is that I thought I could go through 3 different case studies. One with a disengaged team member and talk about how we could use mediation in that setting. The second is around conflict with role descriptions. And then the final one is there's been a harassment allegation, a junior employee lodging a complaint against a colleague about inappropriate comments. And so I thought I could talk about whether or not I would do mediation for those 3 situations and then how so, like what would be the best steps to take and what kind of process would I consider in that situation. But what do you think? I'd love to get your feedback around the podcast and how it resonated with you and what you found helpful. The best way to get in touch is podcast@simongood.com. If you'd like information about my coaching or training programs, you can check out my website at simongood.com. And if the episode today has been useful for you, I'd be incredibly grateful if you would leave a positive review. The little signals that the algorithm looks for, that actual humans are listening to it and that they find it helpful, I'm very grateful for that. So thank you in advance if that's something that you're prepared to do. If you'd like additional tools and resources for dealing with conflict, please consider pressing follow or subscribe. And I hope to see you again in a future episode of the podcast. Bye for now.